Hello and welcome to the Well-Tempered Cast. My name is Nenad Leonhart. I am your host of this podcast where we cover all the things about Baroque music, historical performance practice, historical keyboard instruments, worldviews, life situations, art, and many more things. Now, if you're listening in, you probably know me either from my social media or you just stumbled upon this video for some reason, or I guess this podcast. Well, what we are going to do here is to try and spread as much information about the Baroque era to listeners worldwide. The idea is that the more informed we are about everything that's going on, the better we can make judgment about art, the better we can create art, and the more we can enjoy when we see and perceive something from the Baroque era. Now, this is both for artists and for people who are appreciative of art. It was my goal to create something that will kind of be an entry level to the idea of the Baroque era, but also something that if you're a seasoned musician or you know a little bit about history, this is something that you can on one hand expand your knowledge on, or just also maybe hear one or two different perspectives. Either way, the goal is to familiarize as many people as we can around the world and actually make this music accessible. I have a deep passion for all the things Baroque. I studied harpsichord, I'm playing historical instruments and historical music almost exclusively now at this point, next to my other engagements in different fields. And this is something that I found over the years. I kept returning to these ideas. I kept returning to all that this music stood for. And I found it to be deeply engaging, not just for me personally, but also for all the people that I brought in contact with it when they understood the background of it. Now, the issue that we have today is when we just play music for music, art pour art, that's kind of losing the audience. We don't have the prestigious kind of flair that classical music had in the beginning of the 20th century, where it was a symbol of status and only classical music was recorded because it was the only music deemed worthy to record, right? We had breakout with jazz, with popular music, and so on. So there's so many different genres that people can enjoy today, and very many different genres are, let's be honest, much more accessible than classical music, or in this case, Baroque music. And the reason is, well, one of the reasons is a lack of, let's call it education, but also just accessibility. Because if we don't have certain pieces of information, there is no way how we can create a bridge between then and today. The more I learned about this, the more I found out that, oh my God, the people back then weren't so different from the people today. And in fact, we are kind of the same biological machines, if you want to say it that way. We have the same aspirations for dreams. We want to live our life. We can be happy, we can be sad, we can fall in love, or we can have greatest moments of despair. We can be fearful, we can be angry. And all of that they put into music. They kind of encoded it into a musical language that, and that's the important part, is still used today. Certain rules they discovered back then, and certain rules they made up. And these, the discovered ones, I call them archetypical. These would be kind of innate to us. From a biological perspective, music and speech are closely correlated. And the ones that they kind of invented back then was more looking at what does our musical system do? What does it create? What kind of intervals do we have? What kind of harmonies do we have? And what associations do we find with the particular ones? Now, most of them are still valid today, which to me is crazy. And that shows that our musical heritage kind of built up onto that. Make no mistake, popular music as well, or dare I say, especially popular music, because when you look at the musical elements, they're kind of very reduced. And if you want to create something in a distinct style and use a distinct emotion, you kind of need to take a scope and get a tunnel view of your perspective of which parts you are allowed to use, let's say, in the music that you write. And when you look at the scope, they are very similar, what we are using today to back then. Obviously not in all genres. Obviously nobody writes fugues today that are played in the radio. So there's a little bit of a distinction. But when we look at folk songs, when we look at different type of harmonizations, when we look at dances and so on, there are a lot of similarities that we can take from back then to today. Another great example I found is, for example, traditional Irish music. I happen to play traditional Irish music in formation, and they are, first of all, using this kind of more or less same dances as they've been using in the Baroque era. They use a lot of embellishments, they use a lot of improvisation, a lot of repetitions in their music. Free formations, right? You play the music with whoever is around. So we have kind of a very old tradition that still lives today in maybe a little bit of a different shape or form, but the elements, the original elements are still there. So that's one cool aspect, how to access music from 300-400 years ago, and you can actually go and listen to it, and it's really fun to listen to. I digress. Let's talk about Baroque and what we are here for. Now, this is part 4 of a 4-part series, so it's the last part, and it's about the worldview of Baroque people. It's about how they experienced their life, and what kind of mindsets they might have had, what kind of realities they were facing. And this episode is a little bit a summary of the 3 episodes we had before, but more as a reminder and expanding on these ideas. So if you want to go in depth into the other ones, highly check them out. Number 1 is about daily life and society. Number 2 is about technology and science. And number 3 is about culture and work. Now today, we are checking out the worldview. So without further ado, let's dive into it. First of all, what we need to understand is there was no industrialization back then. Everything that was done was manual labor. Everything was more or less handcrafted. And that was quite a small production compared to what we have today. Same goes with the so-called standards of living, like what we had available if we lived at that time. Every item, from tools to musical instruments, were made by hand, and these were traditions that masters passed on to their apprentices. It was a very slow process. On one hand, on the other hand, this allowed for kind of trade secrets that were passed from generation to generation and that were perfected with every iteration. So kind of every new generation tried out something new or did something different, and they built on the successes of their predecessors. That is what we also can see in the Renaissance, like how amazingly the art was able to flourish back then and how quickly it developed from the rather rudimentary style from the medieval ages to the hyper-realism of the late Renaissance. This making it kind of very unique and high quality, we can also see with musical instruments, right? Let's go to the Rookers family, for example, one of the most famous dynasties to ever create harpsichords. They were, for several generations, they were building instruments, and they started in the 16th century. And every new generation's kind of put in a little bit of newer elements, new things that they were trying out, that they were creating. And I mean, already the old instruments were very, very impressive, right? Like what they could do. And then with every new iteration, creating even more perfected, it's just amazing, like at what a level they arrived, and it is still considered like a gold standard for harpsichord builders today. I've heard of several ones saying, well, we have no idea how they created these instruments, because as much as like we try today, we cannot get to the quality of back then. They had their trade secrets, like some kind of liquid they used to treat the soundboard with, that we have no idea what it was, and so on. Like things that we cannot really measure and get access to with our scientific technological knowledge today. Also, the concept of profit and growth back then was very different from today's idea of capitalism. Trade and crafts were often seen as fulfilling a specific role within the society, rather than like kind of go and expand a business or create maximum profits so you can get rich so you can go and live on a deserted island. That was not what they were doing back then. They were kind of making themselves useful inside of an existing society. So it was much more seen, let's say, as an organism, at least from the economical standpoint, and less of an exploitative one of how can I, like the question of demand, who needs what, was, I would say, much more prevalent back then than it is today. Like today, we kind of try to create demands and try to hype up people for something and so on. In several instances, they did that as well, but the idea wasn't to create as much profit as possible, which today is kind of a quote-unquote god for many people in economics. Also, scaling production was not really possible. So you did have kind of manufactories and so on, but it was a limited output. So kind of luxury goods were really luxurious. You could just have so many of them, and they were reserved for the people who could afford them. Also, this meant that people were much more open to perfecting their craft instead of trying to produce as many pieces as possible. So by focusing on perfection and quality, this is what we get as output. Things that we cannot match today in terms of style, in terms of, in the case of the instruments, in terms of sound, in terms of creation. Like there is just no way for us, with all that we have developed in the last couple hundred years, to recreate that. I find that extremely amazing. Let's go to number 2, which is closely related to this one, and it's about the guilds. The guilds being gatekeepers into wherever you want to go. These guilds played a crucial role in regulating trades, maintaining quality, preserving traditions. So you had to be part of a guild to legally operate, and this meant that you had to be on good terms with the people. So you kind of have, if you were a student, if you were an apprentice, loyalty to your master, right? and really, really obey. So there was not this kind of, let's call it backstabbing, but it was much more closely knit. Also, there weren't as many people back then as we have today. So everybody knew you, so you couldn't just that easily move into a new city and get a new chance, right? I mean, you could, but it wasn't, let's say, as easy as it is today. So if you wanted to be part of the system, you had to be on good terms with the system. And that meant applying all the rules, showing respect to your betters, to the elders, to the masters. And on one hand, this provided a lot of stability and also quality control, because if you just weren't good enough as an apprentice, you would probably get kicked out, and then you cannot do that trade. On the other hand, it also limited innovation. New techniques or materials often faced resistance from guilds because of, fear of what's going to come after, and just kind of trying to preserve the status quo. Depending on where you live, you know that like larger cities are much more open to change, while if you live at the countryside, people tend to be more conservative. Their worldview is limited, they see less things, and so they are not as open to change, much more resistant. And it would have been the same thing back then. However, think about cities being much smaller, so you have also more of a village effect over there. Let's move on to number 3, which is kind of a very interesting one. I don't know where you come from, what was your surrounding, but I come from Serbia, and over there, superstition is a real thing. People are really superstitious, especially the older generations. And this was really a reality back then in the Baroque era. Superstition was a thing that everybody took seriously, even though it kind of contradicted a little bit with Christianity and everything people believed in. Many people did attribute all the supernatural phenomena the natural phenomena they attributed to supernatural forces. Okay, so everything that was happening that had a reason, that was either a blessing or a punishment or a trial, right? So they then did witch trials, a lot of them. And this was kind of the manifestation of that fear going on that, let's say, women who were perceived as outsiders or a little bit as a threat, they could be dealt with. We especially have this in the Middle Ages, but it still continues. And also nature was kind of mystical, right? Forests, mountains, storms, they were often viewed with awe and fear. Oftentimes also, depending on the culture, may be inhabited by spirits or divine forces. For example, the echo. Back then, you have a lot of echo music from the late Renaissance, early Baroque, like echo fantasias for organ, for example, or echo effects happening in music. And this is a musical expression of the theological idea that they had back then. They didn't know about acoustics, that when you call into a certain, let's say, cave or into a valley, that when the echo comes back, that's your sound reflecting. For them, it was kind of the voice of God in the creation that talks back to you. That's a very, very interesting concept to understand, because the echo always is a little bit changed. It's never exactly the same that you put in there. And that's, I think, quite a feat to understand that, wow, these people back then thought that they talked to God when they had an echo thing going on, or talked directly to the creation and something supernatural going on. So you have a lot of these mystical interpretations of what is actually happening. And not just that, but also in instrument building, I know that back then they had like the lunar calendar, and they exactly knew this is the time to cut wood, this is not the time to do anything. Today we know this has to do with the wood expanding and the tides and everything going on. But back then they just kind of knew. I don't think that they did like an empiric trial and looked at what wood is going to expand in which way and then measured every detail. They kind of just knew. And this is closely connected on one hand to superstition, on the other hand to just this idea of knowledge, like why certain things work. I have no idea how they came up with that. Also considering music was kind of a science back then. Well, not kind of. They saw music as science. And then they did, like what we discussed in the beginning, they took these, let's say, intervals, and they assigned certain emotions to them, certain expressive features. How did they know? They didn't do like a study where they invited 200 people and then they measured like what they said and how they felt after hearing these intervals. They just kind of knew. And it was with a lot of these things, which to me seems like a very, very interesting mystery. How did they know? How did they find out? And maybe is there something with this superstition? Isn't it just things that they found out, but also like some sort of truth beneath all of that that they were kind of tracing? I don't know. Let's see. We're moving to magic and alchemy as number 4. So, as I've just said, science wasn't like a science in today's sense. So, science and mysticism, the boundaries were kind of blurry back then. Alchemy, for example, wanted to transform base metals into gold or find the philosopher's stone, which was thought to grant eternal life. And this was a reality for them back then. So early scientists like Isaac Newton or Robert Boyle, they explored alchemy alongside their scientific work. And this is also reflecting of how these pursuits were seen as complementary rather than contradictory. So again, they had a much higher sensitivity of these things around us that we can perceive that today are just dismissed as, oh, that's just like your brain or your thoughts going on, something like that. And for them, I think really the sensitivity to these phenomena were much higher because they were somehow connected much more to something that we are not today. As a great example, somehow how we grow up, we have this huge amount of information, we go through school, we learn so much, and yet when, let's say, there's like a nature catastrophe going on, like you can see the animals going crazy. Let's say there's a volcanic eruption going on, or there's a really crazy storm brewing. The animals will know, and they will panic, they will go into fear, they will try to hide. And you can spot this like with actual animals that we say are intellectually far below us. They still have this sense of connectedness with nature, while us humans, right, so educated and so smart, we lost that feeling of, oh, there's a storm coming, I should take a shelter, or this is a really dangerous place to be in because there's going to be an earthquake any second. Like we just lost that feeling. And back then, I think we were much more in contact with that part of us. Let's move to number 5, the divine right of kings and also rulers. Now, the monarchs back then ruled with the belief that their authority was granted by God directly. This reinforced hierarchical, and absolute governance. That was it. It was particularly evident in figures like Louis XIV, the Sun King from France, who also used directly art and culture to glorify his divine role. And it goes actually to be more than just glorifications. If you really study him closely, I think he's a wonderful, wonderful example of these ideals, and he pushes it to the limit. And everybody goes, like from at least our today's perspective, oh, you know, absolutism is like really bad, and central power, that's not a good thing. A lot of people suffered. This is from our democratic point of view, where we don't really like power concentrations from today's perspective. From another perspective, let's say from the perspective of God-granted power, it is very, very admirable to see Louis XIV being kind of educated to become a king. He became a king in very tumultuous times. Like the power wasn't really consolidated, so he had to work to gain the respect. Obviously, they were still struggling back then, and you had a lot of nobility that wanted to see him removed, that didn't want to see him get into power in the first place. There were some kind of little protests, little actions. I think when he was very little, he had to flee because they were pursuing him. Just look into that. Like, that's really, really traumatic for a kid to go through. And you can see that later in his life reflected in how he understood power and how he pulled all the people very close to him so that he could have absolute governance. But not just that. He didn't just understand like the mechanics of power and then also the mechanics of art and everything going on. He never, ever really took off this role as the monarch. So it was something that he had to be, he had to take, and it wasn't like an easy task. Many people say, oh yeah, you know, like when you're at the peak of power, that's the easiest. Because many want to get there, right, for all the perks that it gets. But it is also one of the hardest things to do. And really, really, like the difficulty of this, there is a report, we don't know if that's true, but like of one of his servants, because you have to imagine Louis XIV was never alone in his lifetime. He was never, ever alone. He always had some servant with him, always present at all time. Maybe he was having affairs, so then he was with these ladies or whatever. But like when he was sleeping in his chamber, there was always at least one person sleeping in the chamber with him in case he needed something. And they were even connected by a thread. So it went like from the finger to the toe. So the king could just like pull the thread, and then the servant would wake up and do whatever was needed. So for most of his life, he was never alone. And there's this one scene where the servant kind of walks out of the room and then walks back in and then sees Louis, who was always having this perfect stance, right? He was a dancer from a young age, and he was always very upright. You have like this Baroque kind of display of who you are, of what you are. And then just like being slouched over in the room by himself. And as soon as he noticed that somebody was in the room, he just went into this stance. I think when he was like 70 or 80 years old or something like that, like very, very, at a very, very old age. So you see also this just almost impossible will to hold all of that power and personify it in one single human. Now, the other great power was the church. As we've mentioned enough in the other episodes, they were controlling education, they were controlling law, they were controlling morality, and obviously church was also God-given, right? So monarchy and church kind of shared this power in a way, and they more or less controlled each other, but also worked together to maintain their authority over everybody else. Let's go to number 6. Death was ever present. So the constant threat of death obviously was much, much, much more ingrained into society than it is today. Today we kind of push it away. We don't really concern ourselves with death or mortality or these things, right? We tend to avoid it. It's much more pleasant to not think about the finality of all things, right? Back then, you had a lot of disease, you had a lot of war, famine, and this kind of was, most cases, fatal. So that shaped Baroque art and music. Themes of mortality, as memento mori, as vanitas, they were common in paintings, in literature, in compositions. And in the regions that were ravaged by the 30 Years' War, beginning of the 17th century, or also by plagues, the focus on salvation and the focus on afterlife, it became particularly acute, influencing the sacred music and also the visual art to emphasize hope, repentance, and divine grace. Now, here, as a short summary, it was also very different from our today's perspective when you say, well, carpe diem, use the day, use your life, like to just enjoy it to the fullest. Back then, it meant like use your life to do as much good as you can before you will be judged by God. So make sure that your afterlife is going to be great. That's a huge difference that is really worth considering. Let's move on to the next one, which is also a little bit of a repetition, the 4 humors. Health and personality were thought to depend on balancing the 4 humors inside of a human's body. So you had blood, you had phlegm, you had black bile, and yellow bile. So these were the 4. And each humor was linked to elements and also temperaments. So you had a sanguine temperament, or phlegmatic, melancholic, or choleric temperament. And this belief extended to artistic representations, let's say characters in plays or operas, and they were often embodying these humor-driven traits, such as fiery tempers or melancholic sorrow. Actually, if you really want to understand like all the Baroque kind of affects and emotions and everything they're talking about, you can categorize them inside of these 4 different temperaments. And the combination of different humors, they're kind of explaining how the human worked back then. Let's move on to number 8, the universal music theory. So music back then was believed to mirror the harmony of the cosmos. It was based on mathematical principles, and a lot of musicians studied mathematics, and a lot of mathematicians and scientists studied music. Ideas from Plato and Pythagoras, they definitely influenced Baroque composition with certain intervals, scales, harmonies thought to reflect divine order, like you had the whole tuning system built in this way. Another thing to consider is that the whole rhetorics that were coming from the antique era, like from old Greece, they were also codified into music. Like you had musical figures that were based on rhetorics. But also this belief tied into Earth as the center. The heliocentric model that we kind of started having with Copernicus and Galileo, it wasn't really a popular thought yet. Many thought that still the Earth was at the center and the human being at the center of the Earth. So this was reflecting like a geocentric and human-centered worldview. During the Baroque period, we get to number 9, which is the emergence of the mind as the ultimate ideal. The Enlightenment, which began to take hold in the late Baroque period, it shifted focus from divine authority to human reason. People actually started thinking and reflecting and asking why. Why the status quo? Why are things like they are? So you had philosophers like Descartes, who emphasized rational thought as the key to understanding the universe and improving society. And this transition marked a slow but profound change in how people view themselves and their place in the world, paving the way for modern humanism and also, what we have today, the individualism that everybody gets to express their thoughts, their unique worldview, their will, right? You didn't have that back then. What you had back then was, and this is the last one, number 10, that God was central to existence. Every aspect of life, everything, from daily rituals to artistic endeavors, everything was filled with religious meaning. You didn't do anything meaningless. Now you can say that this is also the bias that we have as humans, right? We have this kind of bias that whatever happens, we have to find meaning in it. This could be something of an evolutionary process. We don't really know yet what it is exactly, but we know that we're wired this way. And back then, whatever you did, it had to have purpose. And this purpose was divine. It was always measured towards religion and towards God. So, sacred music, architecture, visual art, everything was created to glorify God, to express the wonderfulness of creation, and to inspire devotion in people. When you walk into such a building that was made in the Baroque era, don't you just feel small? Just looking at all these wonders and like the energy that it just gives off is so impressive, and displaying like what wonders are hidden inside of the creation and what wonderful things are waiting for you in the afterlife. And like how imperfect and I don't want to say broken, but like kind of unfinished we are as human beings when we walk into such a building that was created by masters back then. It's just extremely impressive atmosphere, and it also lifts up the energy of everybody around, right? It's the reflection of the divinity, of the greatness of creation. So basically everything that was done back then, even secular works, they were often framed with theological terms. We can see this a lot by Bach, but we see it with so many composers. There's so often just divine symbolism woven into music because that's how music worked. That's how the universe worked. That's how everything was created. And that's why often they wrote Soli Deo Gloria. Glory only to God. They are using proportions, they're using numerology, they're using all different kinds of, if you've read the Da Vinci Code, like this was eye-opening for me back then. Obviously, it's like a fantasy built on these codification of certain themes, of certain things that were going on. But in truth, what they did was really, they were measuring things. They were looking at it from a mathematical perspective, and everything was in connection to divinity. And that's how they created their artworks. And basically everything, when you look at the things that Bach wrote or his teachers, so that goes back to the Renaissance. It wasn't just Bach that was this genius with all these numbers. A lot of them, like even his son, Carl Philipp Emanuel, you can see the numerologies with him, but also his teachers like Reinken, like Buxtehude, and their teacher like Sweelinck, and going back to Zarlino. Like, you see so much of this. So much. And it's also something that we kind of lost today. We don't think in terms of architectonic construction when we talk about artworks. Today, art is more like, feeling. I felt inspired, so I created this. Back then was, well, you maybe feel inspired, but there's also just like clear handiwork and science to be done so that something can be perceived as a finished work. And obviously, every finished work was directly connected to creation, to God, to the divine universe. So I hope that you got a lot out of this kind of summary, kind of a little bit of new inputs, new ideas into the Baroque worldview, how people perceived the world back then, how it differed from what we have today, and what we are used to having like modern ideas and then just assuming, well, everybody else thought the same way. No, we are in a very different period, and things that are normal to us weren't necessarily normal to think back then. We are living better. And remember this one. Today, we have higher standards, and we're living better than most of the monarchs of any time in history. Our life quality of... chances are, if you can listen to this, your life quality is better than the Sun King had in France. Honestly, it's very, very probably better. You have everything. We have food at our disposal any time of day. We have warm water. We have electricity. It's crazy. It's crazy. Just like starting from education. Nobody had that back then. And just to understand and also appreciate how difficult life was and how much strain they had through their lifetime, and to still dedicate this to higher ideals, or maybe therefore dedicated to higher ideals, so that all of it makes sense, so that all the suffering and the unbearable parts of life make sense, so they can step into this afterlife, which is as wondrous as the creations they attempted to do here on earth. I am thanking you for your feedback. If you have any thoughts, if you just want to leave like a short thank you or an idea for a future episode or something like that, it's very appreciated. You can just drop a comment. You can write me an email. You can reach out to me. I don't always respond right away, but I read through every single one of these. And I thank you for tuning in. I thank you for sticking around. I appreciate you. And I will see you in the next episode of the Well-Tempered Cast. I'm your host, Nenad Leonhart, and this is the Well-Tempered Cast, the Baroque podcast. Take care, and see you in the next one.